Medieval England was a land of contrasts. Much of it was rural, dotted with small villages surrounded by open fields. These villages often contained no more than a few dozen families, their homes built of timber and wattle with thatched roofs. Smoke curled from central hearths, and animals wandered close to human dwellings. Life here revolved around the rhythm of farming, ploughing, sowing, harvesting, and tending livestock. The countryside itself was divided into strips of farmland. Peasants worked narrow plots, their labor owed to the local lord or his vassals. Beyond the fields lay woods and pastures. Forests were a source of timber, food, and game, though hunting rights were tightly controlled. Many areas were still wild, filled with dense woodland or marshland, difficult to travel through and dangerous for the unprepared. Castles were the most striking addition to this landscape after the Normans arrived. At first, many were simple motte and bailey structures made of wood, but over time, stone fortresses began to dominate. They rose above the countryside, visible for miles, serving both as strongholds and as symbols of authority. Around them, settlements grew, offering markets, blacksmiths, and inns for travelers. Towns were fewer in number, but they played an important role. Places like London, York, and Winchester bustled with trade, craftsmen, and markets. Streets were narrow and often muddy, lined with wooden houses that leaned precariously close together. Noise, smells, and activity were constant. Merchants calling out their wares, church bells marking the hours, and animals driven through the streets. Churches and monasteries stood at the heart of both villages and towns. Their stone towers were often the most enduring buildings in a community. Bells rang to call people to prayer, and the church's presence was a daily reminder of both faith and authority. Travel was slow. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, often impassable in winter. Most people rarely left their home village, while lords and their vassals moved more widely, riding across their lands or answering their obligations to greater powers. This was the stage on which the life of a vassal played out. A kingdom of rolling countryside, scattered villages, growing towns, and looming castles. It was a world where power was visible in the very landscape itself, from the fields that fed the population to the fortresses that defended and controlled them. The majority of England's population lived in villages, and village life was the foundation of the medieval economy. These were small communities, usually no more than a few dozen households. Homes were simple, built of timber, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs that leaked in heavy rain. A single room might house an entire family along with their animals. Chickens scratched in the dirt yards, pigs rooted nearby, and cows or sheep were driven out to the common fields each morning. The land around a village was organized into a system known as the open field. Each peasant family worked strips of land scattered across large communal fields. This ensured that good and poor soil was shared fairly, but it also meant farmers were tied closely together, their work dependent on cooperation. Ploughing was often done collectively, with teams of oxen pulling heavy wooden ploughs through the earth. Daily routines were shaped by the agricultural calendar. Spring brought ploughing and sowing. Summer required constant work in the fields. Autumn was the season of harvest, and winter was a time of repair, tending animals, and surviving on what had been stored away. Work was hard. Food was simple, and survival was never guaranteed. A poor harvest could mean hunger, while disease could sweep through both people and animals with devastating results. The village was not just a place of work, but also of community. The church stood at its center, often the only stone building in sight. It was where people gathered for worship, but also where festivals were celebrated, announcements made, and disputes settled. The rhythm of the week was punctuated by the sound of church bells, calling people to prayer or marking important moments of the day. Obligations weighed heavily on peasants. Many were serfs, bound to the land and unable to leave without their lord's permission. They owed labor service on the lord's domain, the portion of land kept for his own use, as well as rents in kind, such as grain, eggs, or livestock. Even free peasants, who had more independence, were still subject to taxes and dues. Life was simple, communal, and restricted, but not without moments of color. Feast days, markets, weddings, and religious festivals brought music, dancing, and respite from daily toil. In these gatherings, stories were told, news was spread, and the bonds of community were reinforced. For a vassal, this village life was both an economic base and a responsibility. The rents and labor of peasants sustained his household, funded his obligations to his lord, and provided the manpower needed for agriculture and, at times, military service. The fortunes of a vassal were therefore tied directly to the rhythms and hardships of village life. Towns in medieval England were far fewer than villages, but they played a critical role in trade, administration, and social life. Many towns developed around castles, monasteries, or river crossings, taking advantage of the protection, wealth, or transportation these locations offered. Unlike the scattered homesteads of villages, towns were compact and densely built, with houses crowded along narrow streets. Upper floors often projected over the street, creating shaded, sometimes claustrophobic lanes, while the ground floor served as a workshop, store, or tavern. Markets were the lifeblood of towns. Weekly or monthly market days drew peasants, craftsmen, and traders from surrounding villages. Goods ranged from food and livestock to cloth, tools, and luxury items like spices or wine. Towns also hosted specialized craftsmen, blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, potters, and carpenters whose skills were essential for both urban and rural life. The exchange of goods brought money into circulation, gradually reducing the reliance on barter that dominated village economies. Towns had a distinct rhythm of life. The streets were noisy, crowded, and full of activity from dawn until dusk. Church bells marked the hours. Merchants shouted their wares. Carts rattled over cobbled streets, and animals were herded through the narrow lanes. Public spaces such as squares or market halls served as meeting points, places of negotiation, and centers of civic life. Festivals, fairs, and religious ceremonies often transformed towns into hubs of social activity, drawing people from surrounding areas. Cities, although few in number, were even more complex. Places like London, York, and Winchester were centers of trade, governance, and legal authority. They contained administrative offices, guild halls, and fortified walls. Unlike villages, which were dominated by agricultural labor, cities were home to merchants, craftsmen, clerks, and professionals. They were more cosmopolitan, with influences from trade routes reaching across England and even into Europe. Towns and cities also represented opportunities and challenges for vassals. Many vassals oversaw rural estates but had commercial interests in nearby towns. They might collect rents from urban properties, support markets on their lands, or serve in town governance when their influence extended into these centers. At the same time, towns were often beyond the immediate control of a single lord, requiring negotiation, alliances, and sometimes confrontation with emerging civic authorities. The contrast between villages and towns highlights the diversity of medieval life. While villages were primarily agricultural, slow-paced, and bound by tradition, towns were centers of trade, activity, and relative independence. Vassals had to navigate both worlds, ensuring that the labor and loyalty of the countryside supported their authority, while engaging with the dynamic and sometimes unpredictable life of urban centers. At the heart of feudalism was a formal relationship between a lord and a vassal, defined by mutual obligations. This relationship was cemented through an oath of fealty, a solemn promise of loyalty and service. The ceremony itself was often highly ritualized. The vassal would kneel before the lord, place his hands between the lord's hands, and swear allegiance, usually invoking God as witness. Breaking this oath was not just a legal offense. It was considered a moral and spiritual violation. The vassal's obligations were varied, but generally centered on three key areas. First was military service. The vassal promised to fight for his lord when called, providing knights, soldiers, or personal service on the battlefield. The extent of this service could vary depending on the size of the fief and the terms of the contract. Second was counsel. A vassal was expected to advise the lord on matters of governance, justice, and strategy. This could include attending the lord's court, helping settle disputes, or participating in the planning of military campaigns. Loyalty was demonstrated not only through action but also through guidance and agreement with the lord's decisions. Third were financial and practical obligations. Vassals were often required to contribute funds, supplies, or labor at specific times, such as paying a relief upon inheritance of a fief, funding a lord's ransom if captured, or providing resources for fortifications. On a day-to-day level, this could also mean overseeing the peasants on their lands, collecting rents, and maintaining agricultural productivity. In return, the lord had clear responsibilities toward the vassal. The most important was protection, defending the vassal's lands from outside threats and ensuring his right to hold the fief was recognized. The lord also guaranteed legal support. Vassals could appeal to their lord in disputes, and the lord was expected to uphold justice on his estates. The balance of power in this relationship was delicate. A strong lord could demand more service or tax the vassal heavily, while a powerful vassal could leverage loyalty from lesser nobles or knights to assert influence. Alliances, marriages, and networks of kinship often strengthened a vassal's position, while failure to meet obligations could lead to the loss of land, honor, or even life. The feudal contract was not just a set of rules, but a framework that governed social, economic, and military life. It tied the individual vassal into a larger hierarchy, linking the king at the top with countless layers of landholders and their dependents. It was both a source of stability and a mechanism of control, defining power and duty in a highly structured society. A vassal's life was structured around a combination of land management, military readiness, and social obligations. Their primary responsibility was the estate, the fief, granted by their lord. The size of the estate varied greatly. Some vassals controlled only a few hundred acres, while powerful barons managed vast tracts of farmland with dozens of villages under their authority. Managing the estate involved overseeing the peasants who worked the land. Vassals ensured that fields were ploughed, crops harvested, and taxes or rents collected. They often had stewards or bailiffs to assist with administration, but the ultimate responsibility rested on the vassal. Decisions about crop rotation, livestock, or repairs to buildings were important for both income and the well-being of the people living on the land. Military preparedness was another constant concern. A vassal was expected to provide knights or soldiers to their lord when required, and this could involve personally serving in campaigns. Knights were trained from youth in horseback riding, swordsmanship, and the use of weapons such as the lance or mace. Even a minor vassal might maintain a small retinue of armed men ready to serve on short notice. Campaigns could last weeks or months, and vassals often had to balance these demands with the ongoing management of their estates. Social obligations were equally significant. Vassals were expected to attend their lord's court, advise on local governance, and sometimes host other nobles. They had to navigate alliances, arrange marriages for themselves or their children, and maintain appearances of wealth and competence. Feasts, religious observances, and local ceremonies were opportunities to demonstrate loyalty and status. Daily life was not entirely formal or rigid. Vassals enjoyed privileges that set them apart from peasants. Better food, more comfortable housing, and greater freedom of movement. They could hunt, practice falconry, or participate in tournaments, activities that reinforced both their status and martial skill. Yet these privileges carried obligations, wealth and leisure existed to support the lord's authority and the demands of the feudal contract. The life of a vassal was therefore a delicate balance. They had to manage their estates efficiently, maintain military readiness, navigate social networks, and fulfill obligations to their lord, all while securing their own position and that of their family. Their daily existence was a constant negotiation between duty, opportunity, and the expectations imposed by the wider feudal system. One of the defining duties of a vassal was military service. This could take many forms, from providing soldiers or knights to leading men into battle personally. The specific obligations depended on the size of the vassal's fief and the terms of the feudal contract. A minor vassal might be required to serve a few weeks each year, while a powerful baron could supply dozens of knights and hundreds of foot soldiers. Preparation for military service began long before battle. Training was essential, particularly for knights. Young nobles were often sent to other households as pages or squires, where they learned horsemanship, swordsmanship, archery and tactics. Physical strength, discipline, and skill with weapons were seen as both a duty and a marker of status. For mounted knights, maintaining horses, armor, and weapons was a significant expense, but crucial for readiness. When called to arms, vassals were expected to muster quickly, bringing not only themselves, but also armed retainers. Campaigns could last weeks or even months, and often took vassals far from their estates. While they were away, stewards or deputies managed the day-to-day operations of their lands, ensuring rents were collected and obligations met. Battle itself was dangerous and chaotic. Knights fought in formations, often charging in with lances before engaging in close combat. Infantry, sometimes drawn from peasants or mercenaries, supported the knights but faced heavier casualties. Sieges were grueling affairs, with attackers and defenders enduring hunger, disease, and constant stress. The reality of warfare was harsh. Despite the romanticized image of knights and chivalry, campaigns were exhausting, perilous, and expensive. Military service was more than just fighting. Vassals were expected to provide intelligence, guard strategic points, and participate in planning campaigns. Loyalty was tested in both action and counsel, and failure to meet obligations could result in fines, loss of land, or reputational damage. Conversely, distinguished service could bring rewards including additional land, privileges, or royal favor. In essence, the vassal's role as a military servant intertwined with all other aspects of their life. Maintaining an armed retinue, training for combat, and being ready to answer the call to war shaped how they managed their estates, their finances, and even their social connections. Warfare was not occasional. It was a constant presence that defined the rhythm and responsibilities of a vassal's existence. In feudal England, law and justice were closely tied to the relationships of land and loyalty. Lords exercised authority over their estates, and vassals played a key role in upholding that authority. The legal system was decentralized. While the king was the ultimate source of law, most day-to-day justice was carried out locally by lords and their vassals. Vassals often acted as administrators of justice on their own estates. They presided over manorial courts, resolving disputes between peasants, enforcing fines for breaches of obligations, and ensuring that the work and rents owed to the lord were delivered. The manorial court was a vital tool for maintaining both order and the flow of resources from the peasantry to the estate. The law also bound the vassal directly to his lord. Failure to perform duties, whether by neglecting military service, withholding rents, or disobeying orders, was a breach of fealty and could be punished legally. The lord had the right to hold courts or tribunals to judge such failures, and penalties could include fines, loss of land, or imprisonment. In this way, legal authority reinforced loyalty and service. Law was not abstract. It was a tool for maintaining the obligations at the heart of feudal society. Vassals could also be called upon to serve as judges or witnesses in broader disputes within the lord's domain. Their testimony, advice, and enforcement of decisions tied them further into the hierarchical system. At the same time, the law provided them with protections. A lord was expected to defend the vassal's rights to his fief, prevent encroachment by neighbors, and ensure his vassal's property and position were recognized. Religion and customary law further reinforced these obligations. Oaths of fealty were sworn before God, making the commitment both a secular and spiritual duty. Breaking such an oath risked not only earthly penalties, but the judgment of the church, which added weight to the vassal's duty and tied obedience directly to moral authority. In short, law in feudal England was inseparable from hierarchy and loyalty. Vassals administered it, lived under it, and were bound by it to serve their lords. It structured everyday life, ensured the flow of resources and service, and reinforced the social bonds that kept feudal society functioning. A vassal's family was both a personal and strategic concern. Marriages were rarely only about love. They were tools to secure alliances, consolidate land, or strengthen ties with other nobles. A carefully arranged marriage could increase a vassal's influence, bring additional land or wealth, and secure loyalty from allied families. Inheritance was equally important. Most vassalage was tied to the possession of land, so passing a fief to a son or male heir was essential for maintaining status and wealth. When a vassal died, the lord typically had to approve the succession, and sometimes required the heir to pay a relief, a kind of inheritance tax, before taking possession. Daughters could inherit if there were no sons, but this often complicated the continuity of landholding and might require a husband who could manage the estate. The size and stability of a vassal's family influenced their social standing. Sons were trained from a young age for military or administrative duties, while daughters were educated in the management of households and preparation for politically advantageous marriages. Extended family networks were valuable, providing retainers, advisors, and connections across the feudal hierarchy. Status, however, was fragile. A vassal could rise through loyal service, strategic marriage, or military success, gaining additional lands or recognition. Conversely, failure to meet obligations, loss in battle, or disputes with a lord could lead to loss of land, titles, or even personal freedom. The social ladder of feudal England was hierarchical and rigid, but mobility both upward and downward was possible. Ultimately, family and inheritance tied the vassal not only to his lord, but also to the broader feudal system. Ensuring a smooth succession reinforced loyalty, protected estates, and maintained the flow of resources and service that the hierarchy depended upon. A vassal's private life was inseparable from his public duties, making marriage, children, and succession central to both personal survival and societal stability. Religion was central to life in feudal England, influencing social order, morality, and personal behavior. The church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a political and economic power, with land holdings rivaling those of the greatest lords. For vassals, faith was inseparable from duty. Loyalty to God, obedience to the church, and service to one's lord were all considered part of a moral and social hierarchy ordained by divine law. Oaths of fealty were often sworn on sacred texts, such as the Bible, with God invoked as witness. Breaking an oath was therefore more than a legal matter. It was a sin that endangered the vassal's soul, as well as his standing in society. Religious sanction reinforced loyalty, making obedience to one's lord a moral as well as practical obligation. Daily life was punctuated by religious observance. Vassals and their families attended church services, participated in festivals, and supported local monasteries or parish churches. Prayer, fasting, and participation in holy days structured the calendar, providing rhythm to work and social life. The church also guided moral behavior. Generosity, honesty, and honor were valued traits, while cruelty, deceit, or neglect of duty were condemned. The church could also influence broader social obligations. Crusades, military campaigns sanctioned by the Pope were considered religious duties, and many vassals took part. believing they were serving God as well as their lord. Monastic communities offered counsel and education, while ecclesiastical courts sometimes intersected with feudal law, particularly in matters of inheritance, marriage, or oaths. In this way, religion reinforced the hierarchical structure of feudalism. Obedience to God mirrored obedience to one's lord, and moral authority supported political authority. Faith provided both justification and pressure, shaping how vassals conducted themselves in war, in governance, and in the management of their estates. Religion and duty were intertwined, creating a system in which loyalty, morality, and service were inseparable aspects of a vassal's life. A vassal's residence reflected his social status and the responsibilities of his position. Unlike peasants, whose homes were small, single-room timber structures with thatched roofs, vassals typically lived in more substantial buildings. These ranged from modest manor houses to fortified stone keeps, depending on wealth, rank, and the strategic importance of the estate. Manor houses were usually timber-framed at first, often built around a central hall, while wealthier vassals could afford stone walls, larger rooms, and defensive features such as towers or moats. The interior of a vassal's house was markedly different from a peasant cottage. The main hall served as the central living and dining area, with a large hearth providing heat and a place to cook. Higher status rooms were reserved for the lord and his family, often separated from service areas. Furniture, while still basic by modern standards, included benches, tables, chests for storage, and sometimes tapestries or rugs to add warmth and decoration. Windows were small and glass was rare. Shutters or wooden panels offered protection from wind and rain. Vassals usually had servants and retainers. Even a moderately well-off vassal might employ a handful of household staff to cook, clean, tend fires, care for horses, and maintain the estate. Wealthier vassals could support a dozen or more, including specialized roles such as a steward to manage accounts, a marshal to oversee weapons and armor, and pages or squires to train young family members or attendants. Servants allowed the vassal to focus on administrative duties, military preparedness, and social obligations. Food and lifestyle reflected status, whereas peasants subsisted largely on bread, porridge, and vegetables. Vassals had access to meat, fish, cheese, and imported items, if finances allowed. Meals were often communal, shared with family, retainers, and sometimes visiting officials. Hunting on the estate provided additional food and leisure, and falconry or other pastimes reinforced social distinction. Financially, most vassals were moderately well off, but wealth varied greatly. A minor knight with a small fief might have just enough to maintain his household and fulfill obligations to his lord. A baron with extensive lands could live comfortably, support a larger retinue, and participate in tournaments or feasts. Their security and comfort depended on careful estate management, productive peasants, and loyalty to higher lords, meaning wealth could be precarious if obligations were neglected or estates mismanaged. In essence, a vassal's home and household were both functional and symbolic. They provided protection, organized administration, and a center for social and military life. The physical differences between a vassal's residence and that of a peasant underscored the hierarchy of feudal society. The vassal's life was more comfortable, but it was inseparable from the duties, obligations, and risks of their position. A vassal's day was structured around both practical work and social obligations. The morning often began early, shortly after dawn, with a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and ale or weak beer. Meals were functional but also social, eaten with family members, retainers, or visiting officials. Food preparation was handled by servants, leaving the vassal free to focus on estate management, correspondence, or planning for military service. Much of the day was spent overseeing the estate. This could involve meeting with stewards or bailiffs to review accounts, discuss the collection of rents, or coordinate work on fields, mills, or livestock. The vassal might inspect crops, ensure buildings were maintained, or settle disputes among peasants. Even minor vassals were expected to maintain detailed knowledge of their lands, as productivity directly affected their wealth and ability to meet obligations to their lord. Training and military readiness were also part of daily life, particularly for knights. Even when not on campaign, vassals trained with weapons, practiced horsemanship, and drilled retainers. Physical skill was a form of duty as much as personal development. The ability to lead men into battle could determine both survival and social standing. Social and administrative duties filled the remainder of the day. Vassals held audiences for peasants seeking justice, advised on local disputes, and sometimes participated in councils or gatherings with neighboring lords. Hospitality was an important aspect of status. Entertaining visitors, hosting feasts, and displaying wealth and generosity reinforced social bonds and prestige. Leisure activities provided contrast to work, but were also markers of status. Hunting, falconry, and fishing were both recreation and demonstration of skill. Music, storytelling, and games offered entertainment in the evenings, while religious devotion, prayer, attending mass, or visiting the local church was a daily obligation, reinforcing the moral framework of feudal life. Even with comforts and servants, the vassal's life was tied tightly to duty. Every decision, from managing crops to preparing for war, from hosting a feast to maintaining loyalty, reinforced the obligations of the feudal system. Wealth and comfort existed alongside constant responsibility. The household was both a home and a center of administration, defense, and social influence. Peasants were the foundation of a vassal's wealth and power. Their labor produced the food, materials, and rents that sustained the household, supported military obligations, and allowed the vassal to maintain his social status. The relationship was structured by the feudal hierarchy. Peasants owed service to the vassal, and in return, he was responsible for protecting their rights and ensuring their ability to work the land. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the estate. They could not leave without the lord's permission and owed labor on the demesne, the part of the land reserved for the vassal's own use. This labor could include plowing, harvesting, tending livestock, repairing buildings, or maintaining roads. In addition, peasants paid rents in kind, such as grain, eggs, or wool, or sometimes in coin. Free peasants, while more independent, still owed taxes or dues and were under the vassal's jurisdiction. A vassal exercised authority through both oversight and courts. Manorial courts handled disputes, enforced rules, and collected fines. Decisions were expected to be fair, as harsh treatment could reduce productivity or provoke unrest. At the same time, the vassal had the power to enforce obligations through coercion, if necessary, withholding protection, imposing fines, or, in extreme cases, punishing rebellion. Authority was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the vassal's position within the local hierarchy. Daily interaction between vassal and peasants was common but varied. The vassal might walk the fields, inspect work, or meet with stewards to ensure compliance with obligations. Peasants would recognize the vassal as the primary authority figure in their lives, but personal contact was balanced with delegation. Stewards, bailiffs, and other officials often acted as intermediaries. The prosperity of the estate depended on a delicate balance. Peasants needed to be productive and healthy, while the vassal needed their labor and loyalty. Overworking, unfair demands, or neglect of protection could undermine both authority and income. Conversely, good management, fair treatment, and investment in infrastructure like mills or roads increased productivity and reinforced the social order. Ultimately, the vassal's relationship with peasants was central to his life. It provided the resources needed to fulfill obligations to his lord, maintain his household, and participate in social and military networks. Wealth, power, and security all flowed from this connection, making it a defining aspect of the vassal's role in feudal society. A vassal's life extended beyond his own estate. He was part of a hierarchical network that linked him to his lord, neighboring nobles, and sometimes the king. Travel was essential, whether to attend the lord's court, participate in military campaigns, or manage lands spread across different regions. Roads in medieval England were rudimentary. Most were dirt tracks, often muddy or impassable in wet weather, with few bridges or maintained routes. Travel could be slow and uncomfortable, and journeys required planning for food, shelter, and safety. A vassal traveling with armed retainers or mounted knights needed additional resources, including horses, equipment, and provisions. Communication was similarly constrained. Messages were delivered by riders, messengers, or official envoys, and news of political or military events could take days or weeks to reach even nearby estates. Vassals often relied on letters sealed with wax or verbal reports carried by trusted retainers. Accuracy and reliability were crucial, as miscommunication could have serious consequences for obligations, alliances, or security. Attending the Lord's court was a central obligation. The court functioned as a forum for advice, administration, and justice. Vassals provided counsel, resolved disputes, and pledged loyalty in person. Attendance reinforced bonds of fealty and demonstrated commitment, while absence without permission could be seen as disloyal or negligent. Vassals also participated in regional or national affairs when summoned. This could include joining military campaigns, providing soldiers for defense or conquest, or attending gatherings of nobles to advise on taxation, legal matters, or policy. Such involvement extended the vassal's influence, but also required careful balancing of time, resources, and responsibilities. Even routine obligations such as collecting rents, supervising stewards, or managing lands temporarily in the Lord's service often required travel between villages or estates. A vassal's life was therefore marked by movement, negotiation, and active participation in the larger feudal network. In short, travel and communication were not optional extras, but integral to the vassal's role. They connected the household to the wider world, ensured obligations were met, and reinforced the bonds of loyalty, authority, and duty that defined feudal society. Leisure for a vassal was closely tied to social standing, military skill, and the expectations of the feudal system. Unlike peasants, whose time was consumed by survival and labor, a vassal could devote part of the day to activities that reinforced both personal skill and social status. Hunting and falconry were central pastimes. Hunting on the estate provided food, but it also demonstrated control over the land and mastery of martial skills. Falconry required training birds of prey, a hobby that combined patience, precision, and prestige. Participation in these activities signaled competence, wealth, and the ability to manage both land and servants. Tournaments and martial games were another important outlet. Knights and vassals practiced jousting, melees, and mock battles, both to hone skills and to display prowess before peers. These events were competitive, but also social, allowing vassals to forge alliances, show loyalty to lords, and increase their reputation. Success in tournaments could bring honor, prizes, or even advancement within feudal circles. Feasts and celebrations punctuated the year, often tied to religious festivals, local events, or visits from higher-ranking nobles. Food, music, dancing, and storytelling created opportunities for socializing and reinforcing status. Hosting a well-attended feast demonstrated wealth, hospitality, and the capacity to maintain a household in line with feudal expectations. Cultural and intellectual pursuits were less central, but still valued. Some vassals engaged in reading, writing, or patronage of religious or artistic works. Literacy, while rare, allowed vassals to manage accounts, maintain correspondence, or study religious texts. The church also offered moral and cultural education, emphasizing the ideal qualities of loyalty, honor, and piety. Even leisure had a purpose. Hunting, tournaments, and feasts were not just personal enjoyment. They reinforced social bonds, demonstrated competence, and showcased loyalty and wealth. A vassal's time outside work and military duties was intertwined with the broader obligations of feudal life, reflecting both privilege and responsibility. Wartime was a defining aspect of a vassal's existence. While peacetime allowed for estate management, leisure, and social duties, the outbreak of conflict transformed priorities and routines almost overnight. Military service, defense of lands, and protection of dependents became the central focus. A vassal was obliged to mobilize troops when called by his lord. This could include knights, men-at-arms, and even armed peasants, depending on the resources of the estate. The vassal personally led or coordinated these forces, ensuring that equipment, horses, and supplies were ready. Campaigns could take weeks or months, sometimes requiring travel far from the estate. During this time, stewards and deputies managed day-to-day affairs in the vassal's absence. Defense of the estate itself was another priority. Manor houses, fortified halls, or small castles had to be prepared for attack. Stockpiling food, maintaining walls, and coordinating with neighboring lords or militias were essential for survival. Peasants played a role in this, both in laboring on defenses and in supporting the household during sieges or raids. Daily life during wartime was harsher and more uncertain. Resources were stretched, crops could be left untended, and the risk of violence or loss was real. The vassal had to balance obligations to his lord with protection of his own household, maintaining morale and enforcing discipline among troops. Leadership, decisiveness, and loyalty were tested continually. Crisis could also take the form of natural disasters, famine, or disease. Vassals were expected to manage these challenges as part of their duty, coordinating food distribution, enforcing law, and maintaining order. Failure to act effectively could lead to revolt among peasants, loss of income, or a weakened position within the feudal hierarchy. In essence, wartime and crisis revealed the vassal's dual role, both a military leader and a manager of human and material resources. Success reinforced social standing and loyalty, while failure could be catastrophic. The rhythms of peace gave way to urgency, demonstrating how closely a vassal's life was intertwined with duty, authority, and the security of both his lord and his own household. Education for a vassal was practical, focused on the skills necessary to fulfill his obligations to his lord, manage an estate, and maintain social standing. From a young age, boys of noble or vassal families were trained in combat, horsemanship, and martial skills. This began around the age of 7, when boys might become pages in the household of another noble. Here, they learned manners, basic literacy, and the responsibilities of service, while observing the routines of knights and administrators. By adolescence, boys typically became squires, serving a knight or senior vassal directly. Squires received hands-on training in swordsmanship, archery, lance use, and armor. They cared for horses, maintained weapons, and assisted in preparations for battle. Training was physically demanding and disciplined, instilling endurance, courage, and obedience traits essential for both military service and leadership of men. Education was not purely martial. Literacy was valued, though rare. A vassal who could read and write had advantages in estate management, correspondence, and legal matters. Writing letters, keeping account books, or reading charters were important skills for administering land and navigating the complex feudal hierarchy. Monasteries and clerics sometimes provided basic instruction, particularly for sons expected to manage estates rather than fight constantly. Daughters' education was different but equally important. Girls were trained in household management, running a staff of servants, supervising kitchens and storage, and organizing domestic affairs. They also learned the social skills needed to navigate marriages, alliances, and ceremonies, which could enhance the family's standing. Some daughters received instruction in reading, embroidery, or music, reflecting both status and refinement. Beyond the family, vassals and their children benefited from informal mentorship and observation. Tournaments, feasts, and visits to other estates offered lessons in diplomacy, negotiation, and reputation management. Education and skill development were therefore both practical and social. They prepared the vassal to serve, defend, and uphold his position within the intricate web of feudal society. training and learning never fully stopped. Even adult vassals continued to practice combat, manage finances, and maintain literacy, balancing military readiness with administrative duties. Skills were not just personal, they were essential to the family, the household, and the broader obligations of the feudal system. A vassal's military role was closely tied to his rank, wealth, and obligations under the feudal system. On campaign, he might serve as a knight himself, leading small groups of retainers, or, if he was more powerful, command dozens or even hundreds of men. The level of authority depended on the size of his fief, his personal resources, and his reputation with his lord. Vassals typically commanded men-at-arms and mounted retainers, who were usually well-armed and trained, but of lower status than the knightly vassal. Their responsibilities included organizing troops, maintaining discipline, and implementing the lord's strategy on the field. A skilled vassal could influence the outcome of battles, particularly in skirmishes or when leading flanking attacks. However, ultimate command remained with the lord or higher-ranking nobles. Weapons and armor reflected a vassal's social status and resources. Most knights and higher-ranking vassals wore chainmail hauberks, helmets, and padded gambesons, often with additional plate armor for protection in later periods. Shields bore heraldic symbols, identifying the vassal and signaling loyalty. Weapons included lances for mounted charges, swords for close combat, maces, and occasionally bows for ranged support. Wealthier vassals could afford high-quality steel, customized armor, and well-bred warhorses, giving them significant advantage over lower-status infantry. Compared to ordinary soldiers, vassals were better equipped, better trained, and mounted on horseback, which provided mobility and shock power. Foot soldiers, often peasants or mercenaries, wore minimal armor, carried simple weapons like spears, axes, or bows, and had far less protection in battle. Vassals were expected to fight at the forefront, inspire troops, and serve as tactical leaders, while infantry and archers supported them in larger formations. The battlefield role of a vassal was both practical and symbolic. Their presence demonstrated authority, reinforced loyalty among troops, and embodied the martial values of feudal society. Success in battle enhanced prestige and influence, while failure could damage reputation, reduce resources, or even threaten survival. Military skill, command ability, and equipment were inseparable from the vassal's social standing and the obligations he owed to his lord. The death of a vassal was a critical moment for both the family and the feudal hierarchy. Land, wealth, and obligations had to be transferred carefully to maintain stability, fulfill feudal duties, and ensure the survival of the estate. Most vassals held land as a fief, granted by a lord in exchange for service. When the vassal died, the fief did not automatically pass to the heir. The lord had to approve the succession. The heir, usually the eldest son, was required to perform an oath of fealty and often pay a relief, a sum of money or goods, to formally take possession of the land. Without the lord's approval, the estate could be seized or redistributed. If a vassal died without a male heir, succession became more complicated. Daughters could inherit, but their marriages often determined who would control the estate. A widow might act as steward until an heir came of age, or lands could temporarily revert to the lord. In some cases, disputes over inheritance could lead to legal battles, local unrest, or even armed conflict. The household and retainers also felt the impact. Servants and soldiers might be reassigned, their pay adjusted, or their loyalty reaffirmed to the new lord or heir. Estates needed active management, and a sudden death could create a period of instability. Stewards, bailiffs, and deputies often played a crucial role in maintaining order during the transition. Funerary practices reflected status and obligation. Wealthy vassals were typically buried with ceremony, sometimes in local churches or family chapels, accompanied by religious rites and commemoration. These rituals reinforced the family's social position and reminded the community of the continuity of feudal obligations. In short, a vassal's death was not only a private family matter, but a feudal event. It tested the loyalty of heirs, the authority of the lord, and the stability of the estate. Proper succession ensured that obligations continued, wealth was preserved, and the social and military structures of feudal society remained intact. By the late Middle Ages, the rigid system of feudal obligations began to weaken. Several factors contributed, reshaping the life of vassals and the structure of English society. Economic changes played a major role. The growth of towns and trade created a money-based economy, reducing the reliance on labor services and rents in kind. Peasants increasingly paid rent in money, giving them more freedom and weakening the vassals' direct control over their work. This shift allowed some peasants to gain economic independence, undermining the traditional feudal hierarchy. The Black Death of the mid-14th century had a dramatic impact. Large portions of the peasant population died, creating a labor shortage. Surviving workers could demand higher wages and better conditions, further reducing the vassals' control. Estates that had once relied on bound labor had to adapt, hiring workers or leasing land for cash. Political changes also contributed. Kings gradually centralized authority, building standing armies and stronger courts, which diminished the military and judicial powers of individual vassals. Lords no longer had exclusive control over justice, and their ability to compel military service from vassals became more limited. Social factors accelerated the decline. Education, literacy, and social mobility increased among both vassals and peasants. Opportunities in towns and in royal administration offered alternatives to the traditional feudal path. Marriages and inheritance patterns also shifted, sometimes consolidating lands into fewer hands, but often breaking smaller estates into cash-based holdings. By the late 15th century, feudalism in England was far less rigid than it had been in the 11th or 12th centuries. Vassals still existed, and obligations to lords persisted in some form, but the system had evolved. Wealth, trade, and royal authority began to replace personal loyalty and land-based service as the foundation of power. The decline of feudalism did not erase the role of the vassal entirely, but it transformed daily life, responsibilities, and social structure. Where once loyalty and military service defined existence, economic acumen, administration, and adaptation became increasingly important. The world of medieval vassals, so carefully ordered by obligation and hierarchy, gradually gave way to a society less bound by land and more by commerce, law, and centralized authority. The life of a vassal in medieval England was defined by a careful balance of duty, privilege, and responsibility. From the moment he inherited a fief, the vassal was bound to his lord by oaths, law, and tradition, tasked with providing military service, overseeing peasants, and managing lands. His daily existence blended administration, martial readiness, household management, and social obligations, all within the rigid framework of the feudal system. Vassals lived in houses that reflected their status, from modest manor homes to fortified keeps, and surrounded themselves with servants and retainers to manage the estate and perform labor. They trained constantly, both in combat and administration, ensuring that their skills matched the expectations of their rank. Leisure, festivals, and tournaments reinforced social bonds and demonstrated authority, while religious devotion structured moral life and linked earthly duty to divine order. The vassal's power, however, was never absolute. It relied on the labor of peasants, the favor of lords, and the stability of the broader social order. War, plague, or economic change could challenge authority and disrupt life, highlighting the fragile balance between privilege and obligation. When a vassal died, succession and inheritance ensured that the cycle of loyalty, service, and social hierarchy continued. Over centuries, economic, social, and political transformations gradually weakened the feudal system, but the legacy of the vassal endured.